Now let's talk about the other sacrament, the sacrament of baptism. Remember from the last video, I mentioned that we use the term sacrament when speaking of the Lord's Supper and baptism because we believe that in both of these practices, God is the one who is initiating. God is the initiator, not us. So we do not participate in communion as an obedient expression of our faith in the death of Jesus. Instead, we come to the table in response to God's invitation as a reminder to ourselves that ultimately we depend on Him for life. Likewise, in baptism, we are not obediently professing our faith when we get baptized. Rather, we are receiving God's mark or sign of the covenant relationship that has been established through faith. And faith itself, Paul says in Ephesians chapter 2, is a gift given to us by God. Now, understanding that shift in who is initiating, is it us or is it God, that is critical for making sense of how we practice baptism here at Oak Hills Church. Now, the majority, or if the majority of your church experience has been with congregations that use the vocabulary of an ordinance and typically align themselves or identify as Baptist or evangelical or non-denominational or something similar to that, our view and practice of baptism is typically the single most difficult belief for people with your background to embrace. But let me reiterate that membership at Oak Hills Church does not require absolute agreement with every single point of doctrine, only the absolute fundamentals of the Christian faith. However, because our practice may be different from what many people are accustomed to seeing and experiencing, it's important that we cover this topic in the membership process. So if you still are not sure about what we mean and why we do what we do, or if you just simply have questions, just ask. The first thing that I want to point out and affirm when it comes to baptism is that we do not believe that baptism saves anyone. Getting baptized, like taking communion or church membership in general, is not a requirement for salvation. We are saved by grace alone, through faith alone, in Christ alone, not through participating in things like communion and baptism. The next big point, or next big thing to point out, is that because we align with a confessional Reformed tradition, we also hold to what is known as covenantal theology and a covenantal view of baptism, which leads us to our ordinary practice of baptizing infants of believing parents. And we do not only baptize infants of believing parents, we welcome the opportunity to baptize any believer of any age who has not previously received Christian baptism. And we even welcome those and are very happy baptizing somebody even if you've never been baptized. But we believe and we practice infant baptism. So the inevitable question when we say that, or when I say that, or anybody raises that, the inevitable question then is usually, well, why? What is the biblical and theological basis for our practice? Now, as I mentioned earlier, a key piece of the puzzle for us is our belief that baptism is not something that we initiate, it's something that God does to us. Biblically, we understand baptism ultimately being rooted in the Old Testament practice of circumcision. So in Genesis chapter 17, we read this exchange between God and Abraham. Abram fell face down, and God said to him, "As for me, this is my covenant with you. You will be the father of many nations. No longer will you be called Abram, your name will be Abraham. I will make you very fruitful. I will make nations of you, and kings will come from you. I will establish my covenant as an everlasting covenant between me and you and your descendants after you for the generations to come, to be your God and the God of your descendants after you." Then God said to Abraham, "As for you, you must keep my covenant. Every male among you shall be circumcised. You are to undergo circumcision, and it will be the sign of the covenant between me and you. For the generations to come, every male among you who is 8 days old must be circumcised, including those born in your household or bought with money from a foreigner, those who are not your offspring. Circumcision was established by God as what is known as the sign of the covenant, a visible sign of the relationships established between Abraham and his descendants and God. At the heart of that relationship is an agreement that God would be Abraham's God and that Abraham and his descendants would be God's people. Now, God describes this relationship in Genesis 17 as an everlasting covenant. The original Hebrew uses a word here that essentially means eternal or without end. So this never-ending agreement is actually then found being repeated throughout the Bible, even as late as Revelation 21. So what begins in Genesis 17 establishes the Bible's relational backbone that defines the relationship between God and believers, and it stretches all the way to the final restoration envisioned at the end of Revelation. What that means is that we are still living under this covenant even today. Now notice that the covenant of circumcision, or in the covenant of circumcision, God commanded Abraham to circumcise all male children 8 days old. So the mark signifying that a person was welcomed into this covenant relationship was given to people not when they came to faith, but before personal faith was even possible. We take that to mean that the sign of the covenant, circumcision, was not tied to personal faith, and therefore it represents something else. Now, something else worth noting in this exchange between God and Abraham is that Abraham did not choose God. God selected Abraham and his descendants for himself. And so the act of circumcision was not a sign of commitment on Abraham's part, but it was a mark that God placed on Abraham as a claim of sorts over him and his descendants. Now, by the time we get to the Great Commission in Matthew 28 and Acts chapter 1, Jesus sends his disciples into the world not to circumcise, but to baptize. So with Jesus baptism then comes to replace circumcision. Now logically, there's a reason for this, okay? Circumcision was intentionally about the bloody nature of literally cutting a piece of the body off, and then the allusion to the sacrificial system and Jesus' own sacrifice. Baptism, on the other hand, it points not to a sacrifice, but to a washing and a cleansing and a purification. And so Paul continues to work this out a bit more when he writes in Romans 2 and Colossians 2, and he says this, Romans 2 first. He says, a person who is not a Jew, who is only one inwardly, nor is circumcision merely an outward and physical. No, a person is a Jew who is one inwardly, and circumcision is circumcision of the heart by the Spirit, not the written code. And then in Colossians 2, for in Christ, all the fullness of the deity lives in bodily form, and in Christ you have been brought to fullness. He is the head over every power and authority, and in him you also were circumcised with a circumcision not performed by human hands. Your whole self, ruled by the flesh, was put off when you were circumcised by Christ, having been buried with him in baptism, in which you were also raised with him through your faith in the working of God, who raised him from the dead. Now, in Romans chapter 2, Paul is saying that even for Jews, the circumcision that ultimately mattered was not the one that was done in the flesh that could be easily seen. It was the circumcision that has always mattered is the circumcision of the heart performed by the Spirit. Then in Colossians 2, as confusing and mixed up as the words may seem, Paul says that believers are circumcised with a circumcision not performed by human hands. Instead, we have been circumcised by Christ, having been buried with him in baptism. So what Paul does is he links the Old Testament practice of circumcision with the New Testament practice of baptism. And he essentially says that baptism now plays the same role that circumcision used to play for God's people. And so the covenant is still the same, but the outward visible sign of that covenant that reminds us of this covenant that was first established between Abraham and God, that sign has changed. Now, in our covenantal sacramental tradition, we have simply done a straight one-to-one swap in our practice of baptism. The outward sign of circumcision, it never saved anyone back then, nor did it ever represent the presence of personal faith. And likewise, neither does the outward sign of baptism today. Instead, our understanding of what is taking place in baptism, whether for an adult believer or a child of believing parents, who has not yet and might never actually express personal faith, is that God is putting a mark on that person. And this mark works as a visible reminder that God has brought this person into the life of the visible church in order to be discipled, encouraged, blessed, and directly exposed to the faithful preaching of the gospel of Jesus. But salvation ultimately requires a circumcision of the heart and a confession that God is your God and that your membership has shifted from the visible church to the invisible church, where the true children of Abraham reside.